So, so we've discussed lipids previously, and we know that lipids are the main components of cell membranes, diba? Atong phospholipids and phosphate, then 2 fatty acid, and then the glycerol with, so it's the glycerol, this one, yeah, with fatty acid chains. So 2 of them have fatty acid chains, and then this one is the phosphate, and then we have the choline portion, diba? This is the structure of a phospholipid. So here we will discuss an in-depth discussion on the cell membranes, so how they function, and also the processes on how the cell membranes allows substances to go in and out of the cell. Okay, so as a review, so let's fill in the blanks together. So molecules are made up of atoms. Ba? You have one hydrogen atom. It can make a hydrogen molecule if it mixes with another, if it bonds with another hydrogen atom. Ba? So it's now a hydrogen molecule. Sugars linked together to make, so it could be a disaccharide or polysaccharide. Okay. Amino acids linked together to make. So remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So they make up proteins. And then fatty acids are components of, so they are the components of lipids. Okay. So here, atoms, and they bind together to make molecules. So this is now a molecule. Here, complex carbohydrates are composed of simple sugars. So from this molecule to this molecule, so this is glucose and fructose, and we form here a disaccharide, sucrose. And then lipids are composed of fatty acids. Okay, so this is the fatty acid chain. So this is a phospholipid. These are the fatty acid chains. This is the glycerol molecule. The fatty acid, 2 fatty acids. This is the phosphate group, and this is the choline portion. Okay, so this is the main component of the cell membrane. And for proteins, these are long chains of amino acids. So this is an amino acid. This one is another amino acid. And then it forms a polypeptide. Okay. Then we have nucleic acids are composed of chains of nucleotides. So all of these things, class, that we have reviewed are the major biomolecules. So if you notice, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, diba? Those are the building blocks. Those are the 4 major biomolecules. So the 4 major biomolecules, class, are the basic building blocks of all cell parts. So inside the cell, actually not just inside the cell itself is made up of those 4 major biomolecules, plus some other elements like sodium ion, potassium ion. Okay, so that means that since the human body is composed of millions of cells, we're composed of millions of cells. That means that you're basically a walking carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen bonded together in different ways. Diba? You're basically composed of all those things. So, for this lesson, we will talk about cell membranes. Now, as you know, cell membranes are composed of lipids, but they're not just that. The fact is that cell membranes are composed of proteins, lipids, and some complex carbohydrates. So these 3 major biomolecules constitute the cell membrane. So a membrane is an organized arrangement of lipids and proteins that encloses and separates the cell from its surroundings. So it acts as a boundary of the cell from the inside and the outside. So for prokaryotes, for example, because they are unicellular, so they do not have organelles, diba? So it's just this cell, and then there are molecules inside the cell, and then molecules outside the cell. Okay? And so the plasma membrane separates the molecules inside and outside the cell. For eukaryotes, the plasma membrane separates inside and outside the cell still. And we have another internal membrane, which encloses an intracellular compartment. So because in eukaryotes, we have organelles, diba? So we have internal membranes. Okay? So a function of a membrane is, it functions as a boundary. Okay? Now, because membranes define spaces with distinctive character and function. So there are actually several functions of a membrane. So first one is it acts as a boundary and permeability barrier. So I've said, diba, it's a boundary. This membrane is the boundary. And because it acts as a boundary, then that means this is the one that will restrict some molecules or some substances to go in or out of the cell. Restrict or allow those molecules to go in or out of the cell. So it acts as a permeability barrier. Next is organization and localization of function. So because we have internal membranes, because we have organelles, and organelles are composed of internal membranes. Of course, they are also coated with internal membranes. So they localize, they organize these organelles, and then they localize the function of these things, diba? Kay, if wala ni siya cell membrane, then this would be floating. Just all of these will be just floating in the cytosol nga without any localization, diba? So number 3, they also act for transport processes. So transport because they are the barrier, they are the boundary of the inside and outside cell. So they act as transports for some substances that has to go in or has to go out of the cell. They will act as the transport. And then we have signal detection. So signal detection, because they are present in the membrane, because they act as the boundary, then they will be the one to communicate. So this is related to cell-to-cell communication. They will be the one that are that have the ability to send signals and to communicate with other cells and other substances outside the cell, diba? So the cell membrane has a wide function. So boundaries, localized specific function, transport, signal detection, and cell-to-cell communication. And also, well, there's cell-to-cell adhesion. Okay? So our current understanding of the cell membrane uses this fluid mosaic model. So here, as you can see, what do you think are the biomolecules represented here? So we have a phospholipid. So as you know, these are phospholipids, the main components, the polar head and the hydrophobic tail. Okay? And then we have phospholipid bilayer. So when you have 2 layers, then that's what that becomes a phospholipid bilayer. So nag-abot ang duha ka hydrophobic tail, and then nasa isig katumoy sa end ang polar head. And then you have cholesterol. So cholesterol class are helpful in the kanang kung unsa ka fluidity ang cell membrane. Okay, it's helpful, and we will go into that later. And then we have a recognition protein. So some substances cannot enter the cell because they might be polar. So meaning if they might be polar, then they will not be attracted to this hydrophobic tails, diba? Because these are non-polar. So some of these things need recognition protein. And we also have receptor protein. So this functions for signaling or for communication. Okay, because it's a receptor, and then we have a binding site, and then we have transport protein. So as you see, we have pores, this is for transport, and then we have a glycoprotein. So as you can see, we have proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates present on the cell membrane. Diba? So these are the lipid bilayer. This is the lipid bilayer. So this is the lipid, phospholipid, okay? It's a phospholipid. And then outside is the watery environment. Outside the cell is a watery environment, and inside the cell is another watery environment because it is the cytosol. These are hydrophilic heads, and we have the hydrophobic tails. So the hydrophobic tails are these, atong duha ka chain of fatty acid, and then ang hydrophilic head are this one, ang phosphate of kini. Okay? So this is our current understanding of the membrane structure. So we have the fluid mosaic model. Okay, so in the fluid mosaic model, the proteins are embedded and floating in a sea of phospholipids. Okay, so this is the sea of phospholipids, kini sila. And then some proteins are embedded in this. Because as you know, ang proteins ni act as transport, diba? They have a lot of functions also. So, let's go around a little bit on the proteins, okay? So, usually, the proteins, the integral membrane proteins in the lipid bilayer are alpha helices. So, di ba, natay alpha nga helix nga protein, nasa tay beta pleated sheet nga protein. Diba? So that's a structure of protein. We have an alpha helix, niya na po tayo beta pleated sheets. So nasa integral membrane proteins are alpha helix na structure. The reason is that they must present the hydrophobic surface. So because this one are hydrophobic, these are hydrophobic tails. So dapat the structure of the protein will show such that hydrophobic pod mo show like ma-in contact, comes into contact with these hydrophobic tails of the fatty acid. Diba? So the structure that will give you that requirement is the alpha helix na structure. Okay? So these are hydrophobic outside. So that is why they are compatible with the phospholipid bilayer. So that's why alpha helix ang protein nga naangad to. Okay? Nga part sa membrane ang proteins nga nasa membrane. Okay? So these are, as you know, we have also carbohydrates present in the cell membrane, diba? So mostly these carbohydrates are linked to proteins. So that's what we call as glycoproteins. So if they are linked to proteins, they are called glycoproteins. Glyco meaning carbohydrate. And then we have some of them are linked to lipids, and they are called glycolipids. So glycolipids are also membrane proteins. Okay? So these are the common sugars found in glycoproteins. So we have galactose, mannose, N-acetyl beta-D-glucosamine, sialic acid. And then we have common sugars again. We still have this one, the carbohydrate group. Okay, so mostly this one is as far as I can remember, these one are the principle behind the blood typing. Okay, so you have this sugar coat. So it's still still the adsorbed glycoprotein. So you have glycolipids attached to, you have carbohydrates attached to proteins and to lipids. So you have glycolipid here. It's still, this is the cell membrane, okay? This is the phospholipid bilayer. And then some of these are the proteins, these are the proteins. And then this is a glycolipid. So it's a lipid, yeah, so if you notice, kini siya ba? This is the polar head of the phospholipid and the hydrophobic tail. And then it's attached to a carbohydrate. So that's why it's called a glycolipid. So it's still present on the membrane. And we have this transmembrane proteoglycan. So these things are sugar units, okay? So kini sila, these are sugar units. Okay, so membrane proteins and lipids are synthesized in the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. Okay, so for these membrane proteins, as you can see, the membrane proteins are all alpha helix. So ang alpha helix inani ang structure kana inana. That's what the alpha helix mean. Okay, so these are the integral membrane proteins. We have integral monoprotic protein, single pass protein. Single pass meaning it's like a transport protein nga only one can pass through, and then we have multi-pass protein. We have a multi-subunit protein, peripheral membrane protein, fatty acid or perennial anchor, and then we have this lipid anchored membrane proteins. Okay. So the role of membrane proteins, so as what we have shown in the previous slide, diba? There are several functions of membrane. So actually, the function of the cell membrane is not only due to the lipids. The function of the cell membrane involves the proteins and carbohydrates. So for proteins, ang function niya in the cell membrane is for transport. So they serve as channels and pumps because some things cannot pass through this lipid bilayer, diba? Because this lipid bilayer is hydrophobic inside ane, diba? Because this is hydrophobic in this part. So some of the things, the hydrophilic substances, could not pass through. So they need transport proteins. Okay, these are the channels and pumps. So these channels and pumps are actually proteins. Okay, and then we have links to structural proteins. Okay, and then they are also receptors. So the receptors are also proteins. They are receptor proteins. So they it's like they will be the one to communicate with the outside of the cell. Okay, like receptor, from the word receptor, they will receive signals. Okay, and then enzymes, they function as enzymes. They are localized biochemical reactions. Well, we will go into that when we reach the proteins. So we will have a deeper discussion on enzymes. And then we have energy generation. Okay, so again, for fluid mosaic model, we have proteins embedded and floating in a sea of phospholipids. So these are the proteins, diba? So the membranes class is actually the cell membrane is actually fluid in nature. So phospholipids can move laterally within that cell membrane. So this is the lateral movement, and this happens approximately 10 to the 7 times per second. So imagine how fluid that is. It moves 10 to the 7 times per second. So it happens very frequently, diba? And then this could also be a flip-flop could also happen. So flip-flop meaning this phospholipid could exchange with this phospholipid. So that's flip-flop. But this happens rarely. So approximately once every month. Okay? So imagine how fluid the cell membrane is. So how does the phospholipids move? Okay, so they can move by rotation about the long axis. Okay, so this one, kini mo rotate ni siya. Okay, so ang axis is padung ana and then mo rotate siya. Okay, so it moves just kanang rotation murag sa earth nga rotation. Okay, and then it could also move as lateral exchange. That's mao na ang katong 10 to the 7 times per second. So lateral meaning it could exchange kanang magbalhin-balhin sila ba ini. So like this one will move here and then this one will move here. That's lateral exchange. And then the other one is flip-flop, which is rare. So ang flip-flop is kini nya mo exchange siya sa iyang kaatbang. Okay, sa iyang opposite. That rarely happens, but it happens. That's one of the movement of the membrane phospholipid. Okay? So, lipids are critical in maintaining the membrane fluidity. So, for example, saturated fatty acids stack nicely because they are saturated, di ba? Katong gingon, because they are just straight chain. Okay, wala man sila double bond, so they do not form cis or trans. They do not form kinks. Okay, ang kinks mo ni ang tawag na to kinks kanang murag piko ba? Piko, yeah. And then fold. Yes. Then saturated fatty acids stack nicely, di ba? So these saturated fatty acids are stiffer. So mas gahi sila kay they are arranged kanang murag compressed sila ba? Compressed because they are all of them are straight chain. If you have unsaturated fatty acids, so these unsaturated fatty acids allows the cell membrane to become more fluid because of the presence of these kinks. Okay, because they don't stack poorly. So, di ba, naka-space dire. Because of this kink, naka-space dire. So, it makes the cell membrane more fluid. Okay? And also, of course, because it's more fluidic, then it allows for more movement. So, the length and saturation of hydrocarbon tails. So, this one, the length of this one and the saturation, meaning whether they are unsaturated or saturated, affect the packing and the membrane fluidity. Okay? So, for example, for a membrane fluid membrane, it's because of the presence of these kinks, di ba? So, nasya space dira, so it allows more movement. Whereas, if you compare that with saturated, so katong saturated nga fatty acid, compact kay siya, so mas gahi, mas stiff mas rigid o mas stiff ang atong ang cell membrane. Okay? So, another lipid that affects the membrane fluidity is the sterol. So, in fact, cholesterol is present in the cell membrane. So, remember, we have these ones, ang cholesterol class is like the, siya ang original mga sterol ba, and then, the other sterols are derived from cholesterol. Okay? So, we have cholesterol and then campisterol, cytosterol, and then sigmasterol. So, these are all derived from cholesterol. Okay? So, ang cholesterol class, they actually fill some of the spaces here in the cell membrane. So, not all of these are filled with the phospholipids. Some of the spaces actually are filled with cholesterol. Now, ang effect sa cholesterol class is that it has a loosening or a stiffening effect. Kung high ang temperature, it has a loosening effect, but at low temperature, it has a stiffening effect. Okay? So, ang cholesterol is common in animal cells. So, mo decrease. So, this is decrease ang fluidity. At high temperature, mo decrease ang fluidity. Okay? And then, if low ang temperature, mo increase ang fluidity sa cell membrane. Okay? So, meaning ang low temperature, kung low ang temperature, mas daghan, mas mo allow siya og movement. Okay? And then, kung high ang temperature, Mas stiff ni siya. Okay? So, that's why it's called a paradox. Okay, so, most organisms regulate membrane fluidity. So, like, this is what we call as a homeoviscous adaptation. So, for example, ang fish o ang plants, because they live, their environment is at 0 to 20 degrees. So, they have polyunsaturated fatty acids, diba? So, they have polyunsaturated fatty acids, meaning katong kinks, diba? Nice space. So it makes their membrane more fluid. Diba? And then they also have shorter chains and they have cholesterol pod present. For mammals and palm trees, for example, because we live in a higher temperature, our environment is at a higher temperature, then ang membrane na to usually are saturated fatty acids. So this is what we call as homeoviscous adaptation. We adapt to what the body needs, diba? So we have saturated fatty acids, meaning these are ang atong membrane are more rigid and more stiff. Okay, and we have longer chains, and also there's still cholesterol present on the cell membrane. Okay, so restricting movement of membrane proteins is called membrane domain. So here we have cell cortex in A, and then we have extracellular matrix in B. So it's this one. Then we have cell-to-cell junctions. So these are the membrane domains. And then, so the tethering of membrane proteins to the extracellular matrix or the cytoskeleton. So as a summary, a fluid mosaic model, it has a fluid nature and asymmetric distribution of components. Okay? Remember, it has asymmetric distribution of components. So, ang components niya, we have lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. So, ang lipids, mostly, they are the phospholipids, they are sterols, o glycolipids. Diba? Mao na ang present sa ang lipid component na nasa cell membrane, and they affect the fluidity of the cell membrane. And then we have proteins. So, ang proteins are, we have integral proteins, peripheral, katong lipid link. And ang function nila is for transport, receptor, enzyme, structural support, electron transport, and other specialized functional domains. Now, for carbohydrates, they are in the presence of glycolipids and glycoproteins and external glycocalyx. Okay? So, what do the fatty acid tails of phospholipids point toward each other? I mean, why would they point toward each other in the membrane? So, ang question is, why daw nganong ang fatty acid tails? So, the tails, kini. But why would these tails point toward each other? So, why would it be like this? Diba? So, it's like this because these tails are non-polar. So, they are hydrophobic. Diba? It should be number 2. The correct answer is number 2. And then, we have membrane components like proteins. So, the final shape of the protein determines its function. Okay, so we will go into that when we have proteins. So, think about this on your own. What do you think are some characteristics of molecules that can be fused directly through the lipid layer of the cell membrane? So, remember nga, ang cell membrane is like this, diba? It's hydrophilic here. Hydrophilic meaning it's polar, and this one is hydrophobic meaning it's non-polar, like oil, okay? So, this is not water-soluble, but this is water-soluble. So, what do you think are some of the characteristics na maka-diffuse directly through the lipid bilayer? Meaning, maka-flow ra, maka-agi-agi ra siya sa lipid bilayer. If this is outside the cell, this is inside the cell, then makasud o gawas ra siya sa cell. So what do you think are the characteristics of those molecules? Think about that, okay? And then, remember, ang concept ana is that like dissolves like, okay? Remember that concept. And then, what are some characteristics of molecules that will need the assistance of carrier proteins to move through the membrane? So, how about the molecules that cannot go in or out directly, without any help? So, what do you think are those molecules? Diba? So, because the membrane acts as a barrier of the inside and outside of cell, they are the ones that restrict the entry or exit. So they are the ones that facilitates the transport of materials from and into the cells. Okay? So we have two types of transport. We can have passive transport, or we can have energy consuming transport. Okay? So passive transport includes simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, of osmosis. So this does not need energy. Okay? And then we have energy consuming transport. So it includes active transport and exo or endocytosis. Okay? So in diffusion class, so for example, we drop a dye. So we have these water molecules here. So this is water. And then we drop a dye inside that container. So what happens is that the dye molecules will diffuse, di ba? Mukatag sila into the water until such time nga ang both dye molecules ag ang water molecules are evenly dispersed. That is what diffusion means. Okay, so mukatay ra siya iyaha. So the movement of molecules in solution from a high concentration of that molecule in the direction of a low concentration of that molecule until equilibrium is reached is what we call as a diffusion. So, as you can see, in step 2, the dye molecules diffuse into the water. Kanya ang water molecules diffuse into the dye. Diba? Next, diffusion across a membrane. So, let's relate that to the diffusion, to the transport of substances across the cell membrane using diffusion. So, you have lipid-soluble molecules here. You have O2 and CO2. Lipid-soluble molecules, O2, CO2. So, all of these are nonpolar. So, because they are nonpolar, then they can just pass through this membrane because these things, this part here are nonpolar, remember? So, these lipid-soluble molecules and O2 and CO2 could pass through using diffusion. Okay, they do not need energy because they are readily compatible with the lipid bilayer. Okay? So why does passive diffusion through the lipid layer only occur with gases and small lipid-soluble molecules? So like O2, CO2, those are small and also lipid-soluble. So the reason is because these substances are nonpolar and so is the lipid layer. Okay? Another type of diffusion is facilitated diffusion. So in facilitated diffusion class, it still does not need energy. Okay, what happens is that in facilitated diffusion, there is a channel that helps these substances to pass through the membrane. So for example, in this case we have chloride, diba? Chloride is negatively charged. So because it is negatively charged, that means it has it is polar. Right? It is negatively charged man. Ba? So it is polar. So if it is polar, then that means it won't be able to pass through this non-polar nga lipid bilayer. So because it's not able to pass through this lipid bilayer, then it needs a channel to go inside or go outside of the cell. So that channel is the protein. This is what you call as the channel protein or the transport protein. Okay, so these substances, so for example, like water and ions, pass through the cell membrane using proteins, and they pass through using facilitated diffusion. Okay, so why are channel proteins necessary to move hydrophilic ions through the cell membrane? So because ions are charged, they cannot go through a non-polar lipid layer. But because they are charged, they are polar. So, in facilitated diffusion, transport proteins speed the passive movement of molecules across the plasma membrane. So, they need transport proteins. Channel proteins provide corridors that allow a specific molecule or ion to cross the membrane. So, those are channel proteins, okay, that are embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. And channel proteins, these include aquaporins. So this is for facilitated diffusion of water. So it's called aquaporins. And also we have ion channels. So for ions, it's called ion channels. And these ion channels open or close in response to a stimulus. So they're called gated channels. Kaya na sila gate. They open or close depende kung unsa ang stimulus nga ilang ma-receive. So this is the passive transport by facilitated diffusion. So we have the carrier protein, amino acids, sugars. So we have sugars, small proteins, diba? Okay, so this is outside the cell, inside the cell ni ang blue, and this is the lipid, this is the membrane containing the carrier protein. So what happens is that ang carrier protein has a binding site. So naani siya binding site for a specific molecule. So once the molecule binds, molecule enters that binding site, and once the molecule has bind to that binding site, the carrier protein changes shape. So mo change og shape na ang protein, so mo na mo abli siya, that will transport the molecule across the membrane, and then the carrier protein resumes to its original shape once iyan ang na-transport ang molecule. Okay, so that's how it works. Another type is osmosis. So this is another membrane transport, type of membrane transport. So ang osmosis class is the diffusion of water, okay, through a semi-permeable membrane. So this refers to the diffusion of water, okay, not just any molecule, but it refers to the diffusion of water. So water moves from its own high concentration to its own low concentration. So if you notice here, if this is the membrane, okay, if this is the membrane, then which do you think will the water move here? So kung gikan siya sa kini more concentration, more, then this is, so because here the water moves from its own high concentration. So sorry, this is not more. This is more dilute. So this is the more dilute, meaning mas gamay man ni glucose, di ba? Naaman diri ang glucose. So this is more concentrated in terms of glucose. But this is, water molecule is greater here compared to here kay ang glucose man ang naa diri instead of the water, di ba? So the water will go to this direction. So mo na ang pasabot sa osmosis. Okay? So meaning if reverse osmosis, it will be the other way. Okay? So, because of those transport of molecules class, we have this term, tonicity. So, if the contents of a cell and the fluid around the cell have the same concentration of dissolved solutes, then that is what we call as an isotonic solution. So, the fluid is isotonic compared with the cell. And so, water moves in and moves out in equal amounts. Okay? So, on the other hand, if the fluid around the cell contains less dissolved solute than the fluid in the cell, okay? So, meaning lesser ang solute around the cell, so sa gawas, compared the fluid in the cell, then that fluid, the fluid is called hypotonic compared with the cell. That means more water enters the cell and then leaves than the water nga mo leaves sa cell. So the cell may swell to the point of bursting. Okay? So if the fluid, on the other hand, around the cell contains more dissolved solute, so these are the solute, mas daghan ang solute, then kaysa sa solute nga nasa sulod sa cell, then the fluid is hypertonic compared with the cell. So, more water leaves the cell, okay? So, more water leaves the cell and the cell will shrink. So, let's compare that here. So, for example, these are the red blood cells. And then, let's look at the tonicity of these red blood cells. So, we have an isotonic solution. In an isotonic solution, there is an equal movement of water into and out of the cells. So, ang red blood cell is in its normal shape. If you have a hypertonic solution, because it is hypertonic, then the water movement will be greater out padong gawas sa cell, because the solution is hypertonic. So, the cell will shrink kay mas daghan man ang water nga net water movement out of cell. But if you have a hypotonic solution, ang water movement will flow gikan sa gawas padung sa sulod because the solution is hypotonic. So, the cell will kanang mo dako nga padung mo burst, diba? So, here, so for example, we have an animal cell. So, you have an animal cell. This is hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. Okay? So, for an animal cell, for example, if you have a lysed nga, lysed ni siya nga cell. Okay? Lysed meaning, na break ba? It's lysed, lysis. Okay, ni-undergo siya og lysis. So, in a hypotonic solution, ang water enters the cell. Mao na siyang, the cell is, in this configuration, okay? So, lysed ang cell because the solution is hypotonic. Ni-burst siya. So, for an isotonic solution, because there is equal nga movement in ug out sa cell. So, normal ra ang cell. But in a hypertonic solution, because ang water pod mas daghan ang padung gawas gikan sa cell. So, na-shriveled ang cell kay murag ning niwang ba. Okay? And then, for plant cells, let's go to plant cells. So, for a hypotonic solution, so we have a normal plant cell. So, we will discuss this later na lang, plant cells. We will have this later. And then, so water balance of cells with walls. So, ang cell walls class, they help maintain the water balance as you have observed earlier, di ba? Katong sa hypertonic, hypotonic, ug isotonic. Di ba? So, they help maintain the water balance. And in a plant cell, in a hypotonic solution, it swells until the wall opposes uptake. So the cell is now turgid or firm. if a plant cell and its surroundings are isotonic, there is no net movement of water into the cell. So the cell becomes flaccid or limp and the plant may wilt. In a hypertonic, plant cells lose water eventually. So the membrane pulls away from the wall, a usually lethal effect called plasmolysis. So this is how the tonicity affects the plant cells. So this is the cytosol. This is the cytosol, kining blue-green. And then this is the central vacuole of the plant cell, diba? Kung water is plentiful class, it fills this central vacuole with the water. Okay, so ma-fill ni ang central vacuole. The effect of that is when this central vacuole is filled, then it will push, it will push this cytosol against the cell membrane. Kaya diba, if you imagine that if sudlan nimo bugat, then ang kining this watery environment here, this watery cytosol here, will be pushed against this wall, the cell membrane. So since ma-push man niya against the cell wall, it will help maintain the cell shape. So ma-maintain niya ang cell shape. But if scarce ang water class, then that means mo shrink ni ang central vacuole. Dili siya, it's not enough to push the cytosol against this cell wall. Okay? Because remember nga ang plant cell, it differs with animal cell because it has a cell wall, diba? So because of this the scarcity of water, so dili niya ma-push ang cytosol. So in turn, dili pud niya ma-push ang ang plasma membrane, diba? So manang mo shrink or mo wilt ang plants. Okay? Next is the active transport. So kining active transport is different from diffusion or the passive transport because ang active transport uses energy. So facilitated diffusion is a type of diffusion, but it's still passive even if nangayon siya help with transporters, diba? But facilitated diffusion is still passive because the solute moves down its concentration gradient and the transport requires no energy. Okay? Some transport proteins, however, can move solutes against concentration gradients. Now, in active transport, they move substances against their concentration gradients. So, this requires energy. Usually, ang energy is in the form of ATP. So, ang active transport class is performed by specific proteins embedded in the membranes. So, this is how the active transport works. So, the transport protein, so this is the transport protein, okay? This transport protein binds with both ATP and the calcium. So, ang calcium, mao ni ang ganahan nato i-transport, okay? Kining mga pink nga circle. So, muna itong ganahan i-transport. And so, the transport protein, they will bind to ATP. So, this will bind here. And then, the calcium will also bind here. So, it will bind to the transport protein. Then, energy, because it has bound to the ATP, ang energy nga gikan sa ATP will change the shape of the transport protein and moves the ion across the membrane. Okay? So, mo change na siya, and then it will move the ion here. And then, after that, the protein releases the ion. So, ang protein, i-release na niya ang ion. So, naka-transport na ang ion here to the outside. And then, the protein releases the ion and the remnants of ATP. So, ang ATP, because it has used the energy from the ATP, so it will be converted to ADP and phosphate. Then, so iyang ibalik og release ang ADP and phosphate, and then it will close. Okay? So, bulk transport across the plasma membrane occurs by exocytosis and endocytosis. So, this is for bulk transport. Okay? So, small molecules and water enter or leave the cell through the lipid bilayer or via transport proteins. So that's small molecules and water. Ang large molecules, however, such as polysaccharides and proteins, they cross the membrane in bulk via vesicles. So, ang bulk transport, they require energy because dagko naman kay sila. It's difficult to pass through the cell membrane or even be transported by those transport proteins nga gigamit nato like for calcium, di ba? Katong ganihang examples. Di ba? So, if dagko na ang molecules, it will require energy, and this occurs by exocytosis or endocytosis. So, sa exocytosis, meaning exo meaning out, di ba? This is the transport vesicles migrate to the membrane and then fuse with it and then release their contents. So, many secretory cells use exocytosis to export their products. So, this is what exocytosis means. So, this is what happens. So, this is the cytosol, and then this is the extracellular fluid here, meaning peach, and then this blue cytosol. Okay, so ang material is enclosed in a vesicle. So this is the material that you want to transport, the bulk material. So material is enclosed in a vesicle, this one, with the plasma membrane. And then this is the vesicle, and then ang kini siya mo float ni siya in the cytosol, and then it will fuse with the plasma membrane. It will fuse with the plasma membrane, and then it will the plasma membrane, because the plasma membrane is fluidity, di ba? So it will allow this vesicle to be it will like open, it will fuse manifuse. So mo ni ang pag-fuse niya. So because it fuses this to the plasma membrane, then it is now able to transport, to secrete that material. So that's what exocytosis means. Okay? For endocytosis, the cell takes in macromolecules by forming vesicles from the plasma membrane. So it's the reverse of exocytosis. And it involves different proteins. So actually, there are 3 types of endocytosis. This is what we call as phagocytosis, the cellular eating, pinocytosis, cellular drinking, and receptor-mediated endocytosis. So, generally, this is what endocytosis, this is what happens in endocytosis. So, you want to take in, diba? Endo, meaning take in. So, for example, if, in phagocytosis, for example, if, for food particle, so, what happens is that, it will fuse to the plasma membrane. So this is the plasma membrane, diba? It will fuse and then it will form these pseudopods. And then, mo separate ni siya. So it will now be enclosed. It's a food vacuole. So it's just the opposite of the exocytosis, diba? So, in phagocytosis, a cell engulfs a particle in a vacuole, and the vacuole fuses with a lysosome to digest the particle. Okay, so, this is supposed to be an animation, but it doesn't work. So what happens is just that this phagocytosis, okay, so this is the extracellular fluid and this is the plasma membrane, and these are probably the molecules. So it's difficult to have this. Okay, but anyway, so this is the phagocytosis. This is a food particle, and then mo enclose siya in a vacuole. Fuse siya with the membrane. Okay? So, mo leave na siya as a food vacuole. Okay? Then, in pinocytosis, molecules are taken up when extracellular fluid is gulped into tiny vesicles. So, I can't have the animation. It doesn't work, but so, in pinocytosis, the molecules are taken up, okay, when extracellular fluid is gulped into tiny vesicles. So, that's drinking, okay? It's not eating. So, ang phagocytosis is like eating, but pinocytosis is drinking. And then, we also have a receptor-mediated endocytosis. So, because this is receptor-mediated, so, this needs to, the molecules need to bind to ligands, okay? So, ligands will bind to receptors, and this will trigger the vesicle formation. Okay? So, Ang ligand class, it's any molecule that binds specifically to a receptor site of another molecule. So that are the ligands. So here, okay, kini na lang. So we have phagocytosis, di ba? So mao ni ang solutes na to. Mao ni ang solutes, and then so remember that these are all endocytosis, okay? So mao ni ang solute na to, and then this is the big food, okay? Because it's eating. So mao ni ang food or other particle, it's a big particle. So mo form na siya og kinis, mo form na siya og ingon ani. So the membrane will, it's like the membrane will eat that huge molecule, and then mo close na siya. It will leave as a food vacuole, enclosed is a food vacuole. Okay? For pinocytosis, these are for small molecules, smaller, okay? Smaller substances that still they will be eaten. It's like they will be eaten. Okay? So, musulod sila ani, and then they will also live as a vesicle. So, the difference is that they're smaller. So, they will be, drinking ang term. Okay? And then we have receptor mediated endocytosis. So, mo ni ang ligands kining Y. Okay? So, ang kining molecules nga atong ganahan i-take in sa cell will be attached, will be bound to these ligands. So, ang ligands mo na ang attach sa membrane. Okay? So, they will attach to the membrane, and this will mediate, this will stimulate the cell membrane to live as a coated vesicle. Okay, so if a plant needs to concentrate sugar in a cell, what do you think are the transport that it will use? So, of course, they could use facilitated diffusion, or they could use active transport. Okay, so osmosis is a kind of diffusion. Okay, so summarize what makes osmosis a special type of diffusion. So again, osmosis refers to, it differs with diffusion because osmosis refers to the flow of water, not the flow of solute. Okay, it's the flow of water. So as a recap, the cell parts, such as cell membranes, are made up of biomolecules. So these are lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. Diba? So the cell membranes actively and passively control what materials enter and leave the cell.